My name is Tim Carter, and I was just wanting to speak for a moment about language-based apologetics as opposed to, let's say, tradition-based, or we mentioned fallible religious constructs, creeds, confessions, even charts, for example. Historic charts have been made over the years. Here's a very old copy of Clarence Larkin's charts and dispensationalism. Very good work. Anyone that labors in the word respects someone else who did. However, in language-based apologetics, if anything about a chart, which if you start with your chart, and a lot of us had, I run into people all the time who were taught while the chart was in the room, or were taught the chart, so they really assure that the Bible fits that chart. It never occurs to them that maybe we might be forcing some things to fit, because the Bible doesn't support a chart. For example, we don't use a chart to then interpret the Bible. The Bible itself, everything else is tried by it. But language-based apologetics, for example, in KOINE Dillich, it's a several volume commentary on the Old Testament, came out in 1996. It's probably one of the most professionally prepared. But for example, on page 30, he just begins in Genesis 1 saying, "And the earth was," and then he puts in parentheses, "not became, waste and void." So somehow he already has some view of the earth and its age or condition. So he just puts in print. Now, he gave no rationale for that statement. This book, Wayne Grudem's Systematic Theology, probably one of the best out there. You won't find anyone, I suppose, any more elite writers or scholastic people than KOINE Dillich, Wayne Grudem. And he made a comment, for example, on page 287 about Genesis 1. He said it's an alternative but doubtful translation, speaking of become. And then, of course, Walty and O'Connor, this Introduction to Biblical Hebrew Syntax, which I used in graduate school, they at least had a rationale using the Masoretic vowel system, something in writing, although that came much later. But they showed that ha-yatha in Genesis, for example, ha-yah, or verse 2, should be was and not become. So fortunately for me, when I was in school, I wrote a paper for one professor based upon this and gave a good rationale for why it could be the word was, only learning from this how to use the vowel pointings and the indications that each of those diacriticals emphasize. But language-based, then, if you go look in the New Testament, you find that the KOINE Greek New Testament translates ha-yah as genomai, which is come to be. You say, what's the big deal? Nothing's the big deal. It's just, if whatever theology do you develop, if it contradicts the language, then modify your theology, improve it so that it doesn't contradict the language, for example. So apparently these three scholars, these people that are unsurpassed in today's among today's modern scholars, they have a strong bias toward something, that they are driven by that bias to translate ha-yah as was and not become, only for me to find out later that, as I was taught in seminary, that genomai is the Greek New Testament word, which in the KOINE Greek, that is a translation of the Old Testament, that is when it quotes Old Testament passages. So interestingly enough, I was taught to consider that KOINE language. So there's a language, and then Hebrew, biblical Hebrew, there's a language. So I just yield to the language of the KOINE Greek New Testament to determine ha-yah as become. And of course, obviously, to all the people who struggle to reverse that translation to was, then they're the ones that believe the gap theory is true if it's come to be, not me. So, but back to language base, if your theology contradicts language of the Bible, for example, people have a theology called libertarian free will, and Sam Harris, a young neurological scientist, an atheist, is speaking against free will, saying it's an illusion. But when he spoke of free will, he said so that a person could have done otherwise under the circumstances. I think he's speaking of a classical libertarian view. And then, of course, on the other hand is compatibilism, which is advocated by a lot of people today. David Hume wrote that. So it's a philosophy. But what's the language say? Well, in Genesis 2:21 it says God caused a deep sleep to come upon Adam. Genesis 15:6, which was omitted by the King James translators. It's not that what they translated was incorrect. It's their strong Calvinism or strong Calvinistic background does not free them to translate, to put causation in where it refers to believe, because in Genesis 15:6 they omitted Abram caused himself to believe God, and that willingness to cause himself to believe, was counted as righteousness. Well, then in Isaiah 53:1 they omitted again where Isaiah said, who will cause himself to believe our report? So based on the language, we have Genesis 1, Ha Yah has come to be. We have in Genesis 15, Genesis 2 and Genesis 15, a definition of causal agency, which is discussed today in the highest levels in some of the most elite theological schools in the world. I know Biola University, and they have a Dr. William Lane Craig, and he mentions agent causation. Well, that's in the Hebrew language. So language-based apologetics, now it's very narrow because there's really not a lot of data. A lot of these large, ever-expanding libertarianism, compatibilism, this feigned struggle between free will and the sovereignty of God. Well, sovereignty, when we look that up, we study God, and we find there's in the KOINE text places where it says he desires, and then we find places where he determines things. So we see that sovereignty, according to the language. Now that's why I say I yield to the language, and in this apologetics is really not a sophisticated kind. That's why we speak of ourselves as those who share the common faith and common salvation. It's a common language. It won't sell books like this. It won't generate large, voluminous, systematic theologies like this, because when he said that come to be is a doubtful alternative, a doubtful translation, and it's an alternative, he had no substantiation for it. Of course, he didn't need to. His audience was, let's say, biased or primed, but language-based now eliminates the dilemma of Genesis 1:1 and 1:2. Language eliminates the dilemma of understanding what is a Bible definition of free will, agent causation. The first act of faith that is recorded with our interest in mind would be Genesis 15:6. Abram caused himself to believe God. So there, just with a little bit of use of the language. Now I don't know Hebrew, I don't know Greek. No one really could say they know those things like in an absolute sense. We use them. My hermeneutics teacher emphasized usage. My systematic theology teacher emphasized usage and lexical support. So to become the theologian I was trained to become required a lot of effort, but once you navigate through the newness, the oddness of those languages, because we're not familiar with them, they solve virtually everything. And one thing, for back to the chart all the way to eschatology, people are asking pre and post-trib questions, not considering the language of the Bible. So when you consider the language of the Bible, which I'm working on my own chart, and it's just simply based on the hermeneutic principle that if it contradicts the language, then modify your chart. So I'm working on a chart that does not require the breaking apart of the resurrection of the dead elect in Christ and those of us who are alive, the living ones, the ones remaining around. because it says we'll be seized away together with them, the dead who were raised simultaneously. We'll be simultaneously seized away. So, and then in Matthew 24, the language says in verse 2 and 4, blepo, the eyes, and then when it says that they will see the Son of Man coming much later in that text, Matthew 24, that word is a mental realization. So the dilemma about people saying Jesus returned in 70 AD, that's solved by language, the Bible language. And the cutoff, the short, making those days short for our sake, that's the language resolves that, because we see in the midst of that tribulation, there Jesus is there, God's involved, he cuts it off for our sake, the elect. So the chart won't be sensational because it won't have a dilemma that requires things outside the Bible language to be conjured and constructed to solve. So in one way, language-based apologetics really makes a lot of the things people have built offline really unnecessary, and I think that's something I never anticipated, because in my ignorance of attending seminary, my first year there was my first year at even attempting to be a member of one of the Lord's New Testament churches. So it was easier for me as a commoner, and I mean that literally, to study the languages, because the glossaries are so small that a reader's New Testament like this one, it's just a few pages of the entire glossary that a person would need of the words that occur over 30 times. So for commoners, language-based apologetics that adheres to the principle of hermeneutics, that kind of action, inflection, word meaning, root meaning, etymology, syntax, grammar, all the parts of speech, things like that. It sounds like it would be complicated. It's just not really. The English grammar to ACE, New Testament Greek, these are really small books. People are like, well, what do you use? Well, these little small books. Here's a word list for Hebrew. English grammar for language students, very small, concise. Yes, I have a slide rule, and it's for Hebrew, strong verb. You see that? That's really good. Here's a really good book on English grammar, on how to ace biblical Hebrew. And of course, you know, embarrassing as it is, here's my Hebrew grammar, and I put it in a 3-ring binder because I used it so much it would literally, the binding fell apart. And that's okay. It's just that from Genesis to Revelation, we seem to have all of these dilemmas. And for example, just by ignoring the language, the idea of placing the new birth prior to believe, punctular action, has just caused so much grief for people. And yet the Bible distinguishes very clearly believe from believing. Believe is an action that a person that hears the gospel is, matter of fact, the purpose of the gospel is in order that that person who hears or reads it might deliberately cause himself to believe. Punctular, singular, simple form of action, and trust that. Now that causation comes from Genesis 15:6, the Hebrew language. The deliberation comes from the subjunctive mood. But it really cuts out a lot of clutter, and as Paul Goodwin said once in his writings, a book in his later life, how he wished he had put his priority on soul winning. Well, for us at IamKOINE.org, Landmark Missionary Baptist Church, being mission minded and driven to go out and make disciples, we don't really want the clutter. We don't want the ever expanding. So we can teach people very clearly, concisely, and show them in 1 John 5:1 that the new birth precedes the person who is continuing to believe, the believer. It's a gerundive noun, a verbal substantive, and we don't need those terms. We certainly don't use them, but look at all the grief that could have been saved and prevented and avoided, all the peace people could have had. And look at eschatology, where hermeneutics is ignored. People don't know that every book in the Bible, from Genesis to Revelation, applied at the time it was written. Present, preterism. For us, it's all relevant to our history. For us, it's the only way we understand our future. and it's all spiritual. So there is no such thing in the abstract world where everything is past, as the full preterist attempt to do. There's really no such, I mean, no one. Anyway, those things just cause unnecessary dissonance and disagreement. But just with the language from Genesis, even in Genesis 6, the sons of God, when we look that word up, that phrase, we see that it applies to both men and angels. There's a lot of conflict over, well, how did those sons of God take the daughters of men? Some say they're angels, Brother Carter. Well, without consulting the language, you won't notice that angels are spirit beings, and that there are angels that had ability in intellectual and spirit realms. So of course they could and commandeer people, let's say the Sethites, and lead them to places they shouldn't have gone. But again, agent causation says they're still responsible because they caused themselves to cooperate with these angels. But to somehow, because we don't follow the language, we'll have to come up with either angels are now corporeal beings, which they're not. Even in the ones held in Tartarus, those apparently are exceptional angels who committed some exceptional crimes, which if we go back to Genesis 6, otherwise we'd still be going through that same havoc on the earth because of angels who are over things that are probably more powerful than man. Obviously could cooperate with them or refuse to, but once he cooperated, he couldn't come back. But the language helps solve that problem, so that all that grief, or even in the New Testament, some people are trying to retranslate or re-understand angels not given in marriage to try to help whichever way you want that argument to go. But they're not given in marriage, and the same reason we're not. We're the bride, we're married to Christ, and in heaven we aren't there in our same relations that we had down here. We're the bride of Christ here on the earth. We'll be the bride of Christ then. But language-based apologetics, I can see why it's very disappointing, because there's just so much less material. And for a commoner like me, well, that's good news. Once I understand a text, once I understand how Yah has come to be, once I understand free will is causal agency, once I understand sons of God are spirit beings, and it can refer to men, and when it does refer to angels, it doesn't change the nature of their being. So I don't have to deal with a hybrid product and how to explain genetically and all of that. I don't have to deal with the grief of putting the new birth before believe, which is ignored by people who can't and don't use language as the base of their apologetics, because their denominated doctrine, their peer group, their religion, or their creed or confession doesn't allow it. But for us here at IamKoine.org, specifically we who are working and serving through Landmark Missionary Baptist Church, we're happy to clear the clutter, and we have plenty to do besides ever expanding and contributing to these contradictions. Even ignoring the language in John 6 where the Father draws, you can use that text. We have video on that, shows very clearly how plainly it's stated. John 3:16, if we ignore the kind of action and the purpose for that text, it's the same as people are argue over for whom did Christ die, and yet the story, the account of Jesus laying down life for his sheep was written in order that you might deliberately cause yourself to believe. So when the Bible says, for a language-based apologist, when it says that Jesus came to die for the sins of his people, that would make someone want to ask, how do I become one of his people? When we teach that Jesus laid down his life as a good shepherd for his sheep, it makes someone want to know, how do I become one of his sheep? How can I become his sheep, he become my shepherd? And that leads us into the purpose for which the gospel is written. It wasn't written to provoke this endless banter, or as some people use it, they ask for whom did Christ die, to somehow sort out Calvinists from Arminians. No, Christ's gracious death and giving of his life is to provoke men, and the purpose of it was to provoke them to deliberately cause themselves to believe. And that way we're out of the equation. The apologist, the evangelist, the preacher, the pastor, the teacher of the Bible, he doesn't have to wonder, am I investing or am interposing myself onto the text and into my message and into my work? No, you can just void yourself of the text, take yourself out of the message, and it's all gospel, it's all good, and it's all about everything God wants people to know, and they want Him to know. So when you invite someone to your church, say, yes, our church, Jesus died for our church. Well, that's remarkable, that an opinion that high of your church, knowing that Jesus gave His blood for it, people would definitely demonstrate a reverence and awe for the church that's not typically found today. So that's what language-based apologetics is. And without the freedom, for example, if I was a Calvinist, I would have to study to support Calvinism. If I were an Arminian, I'd have to study to support that all through. That's rather self-evident. But IamKoine.org is a language-based apologetics ministry. It disappoints people because once you learn these things about the language, they won't change. I won't be 10 years from now teaching that free will is somehow the libertarian camp is right or somehow compatibilism is right. The good news is neither one of those are what the scriptures say. So now that we know that, we can move on. I won't buy into ha-yatha is was and say it's an alternate trend. No, it'll always be become. That's settled, determined, because the New Testament, which was inspired, translated ha-yah as genomai, which has come to be. And I'll never put the new birth ahead of believe, puncture, but always before the continuation. So that's a lot of freedom. Have a good day.